Joshua sat alone in his apartment, staring at the stack of unpaid bills on his kitchen table. His hands trembled as he calculated the numbers for the third time that evening. The fear was suffocating, wrapping around his chest like a vice. He had lost his job 2 months ago, and despite countless applications, nothing had materialized. His phone buzzed with another notification, probably another creditor. Joshua felt his heart race faster. The anxiety had become his constant companion, whispering worst-case scenarios in his mind every waking moment. He wondered how he would survive another week. That night, unable to sleep, Joshua remembered something his grandmother used to say before she passed. She would often quote Jesus saying, "Fear not," and would smile peacefully even during the hardest times. He had never understood how she maintained such calm in the face of difficulty. Desperate for anything that might bring relief, Joshua opened his laptop and searched for the meaning behind those words. He stumbled upon a lecture by Joel Goldsmith about spiritual principles and the true nature of fear. Something about the title caught his attention, and he pressed play. The voice on the recording spoke with unusual authority and gentleness. Goldsmith explained that fear is not something to be fought or suppressed, but understood. Joshua leaned closer to the screen, his interest suddenly awakened despite his exhaustion. Goldsmith's words began to penetrate Joshua's consciousness. The teacher explained that when Jesus repeatedly said, "Fear not," he was not giving a command to simply stop being afraid. He was revealing a profound spiritual truth about the nature of reality itself. According to Goldsmith, Jesus understood that fear exists only when we believe we are separate from the divine source of all life. When we think we must rely solely on our own limited human resources, fear naturally arises. We fear lack, loss, disease, and death because we see ourselves as vulnerable and alone. Joshua paused the recording and sat back in his chair. This perspective was entirely different from anything he had heard in church growing up. He had always thought fear not meant he should try harder to be brave, that his fear was a personal failing or lack of faith. Goldsmith continued, explaining that Jesus lived from a consciousness of oneness with God. From this awareness, he could see that the things humans fear most have no real power. Material circumstances, though they appear threatening, cannot touch the eternal spiritual reality that is our true nature. The teacher's voice grew more emphatic as he described how Jesus performed miracles not through supernatural intervention, but through spiritual understanding. He saw through the illusion of separation and recognized the presence of God where others saw only problems and limitations. Over the following week, Joshua listened to the recording multiple times. Each time, he discovered new layers of meaning. Goldsmith taught that fear is essentially a belief in two powers, God and something else that can harm us. But spiritual truth recognizes only one power, one presence. Joshua began to see how his fear had been rooted in the belief that his well-being depended entirely on external circumstances. His job, his bank account, other people's decisions. These had seemed like the source of his security. When they disappeared, terror filled the vacuum. But Goldsmith pointed to a different foundation. He explained that our true source is the infinite intelligence and love that created the universe. This source does not fluctuate with stock markets or employment trends. It is permanent, unchanging, and always available. The concept felt radical to Joshua. Could it really be true that his security did not depend on having a job or money in the bank? Everything in his practical experience seemed to contradict this idea, yet something deep within him resonated with these words. Goldsmith addressed this exact doubt in his teaching. He acknowledged that spiritual principles seem impractical to the human mind, but he insisted that thousands of people throughout history had proven these truths by experience. When truly understood and lived, they produced tangible results in the material world. Joshua decided to test these principles in a small way. Instead of waking up and immediately diving into panic about his situation, he spent the first hour of each morning in quiet contemplation. He practiced recognizing the presence of divine intelligence within and around him. At first, his mind resisted fiercely. Thoughts of his dwindling bank account and mounting debt would intrude constantly. But he persisted, gently returning his attention to the truth that Goldsmith had illuminated. There is only one power, one source, and it is forever giving of itself. something unexpected began to happen. The crushing weight of fear that had been his constant companion started to lift, not all at once, but gradually. In moments of quiet awareness, Joshua experienced a peace he had never known, even when his circumstances had been comfortable. This peace was not the absence of challenges or the presence of solutions. It was something deeper, a sense of being held by something vast and loving. Joshua realized this was what his grandmother had possessed, that mysterious calm that no external circumstance could disturb. He remembered Goldsmith explaining that Jesus could sleep peacefully in a boat during a raging storm because he knew the truth about God's presence. The storm was real on one level, but it could not touch the deeper reality of divine order and love. 2 weeks into his daily practice, Joshua received a call from a former colleague named Robert. They had worked together years ago, and Robert had recently started his own consulting firm. He needed someone with Joshua's specific expertise for a major project. The timing seemed miraculous, but Joshua was beginning to understand what Goldsmith taught about divine timing. When we cease blocking the flow of good through fear and anxiety, when we become receptive to divine guidance, opportunities appear that were always there but invisible to our fear-clouded vision. Joshua accepted the project, but something had fundamentally shifted in him. He no longer felt desperate or grasping. The job was welcome, but his sense of security no longer depended on it. He had touched something deeper, more reliable than any external circumstance. As he worked on Robert's project, Joshua noticed he approached challenges differently. Where he once would have panicked at difficulties, he now paused to recognize the presence of infinite intelligence available to guide him. Solutions came more easily, creativity flowed more naturally. Goldsmith had taught that when we understand why Jesus said, "Fear not," we begin to live from a different consciousness. We stop trying to manipulate circumstances through anxiety and effort. Instead, we align ourselves with the divine flow that is always moving toward greater expression and fulfillment. Robert was so impressed with Joshua's work that he offered him a permanent position as a senior consultant. The salary was higher than his previous job, and the work was more aligned with his passions. But Joshua knew this was not the real miracle. The real miracle was the transformation of his consciousness. He had discovered that his grandmother's peace was not the result of having easy circumstances. It came from understanding a spiritual truth that transcended circumstances. Fear had lost its power over him because he no longer believed in its fundamental premise. Joshua continued his morning practice of recognizing divine presence. Goldsmith had emphasized that spiritual understanding is not a one-time achievement, but a daily practice. Every day we must choose again to see through the illusion of separation and remember the truth of oneness. One morning during his contemplation, Joshua had a profound realization. He saw that every time Jesus said, "Fear not," he was inviting people to share his consciousness, his awareness of God's immediate presence. It was not a command, but an invitation to transformation. This understanding changed everything. Joshua was no longer trying to force himself to stop being afraid while still believing in all the reasons for fear. Instead, he was learning to see differently, to perceive the spiritual reality that exists beyond material appearances. Joshua began sharing his discovery with others who were struggling with fear and anxiety. He spoke carefully, knowing that these principles could sound like impractical mysticism to those who had not experienced their power. But to those who were ready, his words carried the ring of truth. He met Rebecca, a woman in her 40s who was paralyzed by fear of a health diagnosis. She had been told she might have a serious illness and was waiting for test results. The fear was consuming her, making it impossible to function normally or find any peace. Joshua shared what he had learned from Goldsmith about the nature of fear and the meaning of "fear not." He explained that Jesus was not telling her to be brave in the face of a real threat. He was revealing that the threat itself exists only in a limited perception of reality. Rebecca struggled to grasp this at first. Her body, the potential illness, the doctors and their tests, all seemed undeniably real and threatening. How could spiritual truth possibly change these concrete facts? Joshua understood her confusion because he had felt the same way. He explained that spiritual understanding does not deny the appearance of problems. Instead, It sees beyond appearances to the underlying reality of divine perfection. When we align our consciousness with this truth, the appearance itself often changes, not through our will but through divine law. Rebecca decided to try Joshua's approach while waiting for her test results. Each morning, instead of spiraling into fear scenarios, she spent time recognizing the presence of perfect life that is God. She acknowledged that her true being was spiritual, eternal, and untouchable by disease. The practice was difficult at first. Her mind kept returning to fear, analyzing symptoms, imagining worst outcomes. But gradually, like Joshua before her, she began to experience moments of profound peace. In these moments, she touched something real, something more substantial than her physical concerns. Goldsmith had taught that this peace is not escape or denial. It is the recognition of what is eternally true. Disease, lack, and danger exist in the realm of material appearance, but they have no existence in spiritual reality. As we dwell in spiritual awareness, material appearances come into alignment with spiritual truth. Rebecca's test results came back negative. There was no serious illness after all. But like Joshua with his job offer, she knew the real healing had already occurred. She had been healed of fear itself, of the belief that her life and well-being were at the mercy of material conditions. She called Joshua to thank him, her voice filled with emotion. She said she finally understood what Jesus meant by "fear not." It was not a command to be brave, but a revelation that there is nothing to fear when we understand the true nature of reality and our relationship to God. If this message is resonating with you, subscribe to this channel and activate notifications so you don't miss the spiritual insights that can transform your relationship with fear forever. Joshua's consulting work flourished, but he found himself increasingly drawn to share the spiritual principles that had transformed his life. He started a small study group focused on Goldsmith's teachings about fear, faith, and spiritual consciousness. The group met weekly in his apartment. People came from various backgrounds, each carrying their own burden of fear. Some feared financial ruin, others feared loss of loved ones, illness, failure, or loneliness. Despite their different circumstances, Joshua recognized they all suffered from the same fundamental misconception. They believed their well-being depended on external conditions remaining favorable. They believed they were separate from their source, vulnerable and alone in a threatening world. This belief is the root of all fear, and it is precisely what Jesus addressed when he repeatedly said, "Fear not." Joshua guided the group through Goldsmith's teaching systematically. They studied the idea that God is the only power, the only presence, the only life. Where God is, nothing else can be. Fear, disease, lack, and danger cannot exist in the presence of infinite good. At first, this sounded like positive thinking or wishful denial to some group members. But Joshua emphasized that Goldsmith was not teaching affirmations or mental manipulation. He was pointing to an actual spiritual reality that exists whether we acknowledge it or not. A man named Christopher joined the group, bringing a particularly challenging situation. His teenage daughter had fallen into drug addiction, and despite multiple attempts at rehabilitation, she continued to relapse. Christopher's fear for her life was overwhelming and entirely understandable. He listened to the discussions about fear with barely concealed frustration. How could spiritual principles help when his daughter's life was genuinely at risk? This was not abstract philosophy, but a real emergency requiring real action. Joshua recognized the legitimacy of Christopher's concern. But Joshua also knew that fear itself was preventing Christopher from being truly helpful to his daughter. His terror kept him reactive, controlling, and unable to see clearly. Moreover, his fear was actually an unconscious agreement with the power of addiction, affirming its reality and strength. Goldsmith taught that to truly help anyone, we must first establish ourselves in spiritual truth. We must see beyond the appearance of the problem to the spiritual perfection that is always present. This is not denial, but the highest form of practical help we can offer. Christopher was skeptical but desperate enough to try anything. Joshua suggested he spend time each day recognizing his daughter's true spiritual identity. Not the addict, not the troubled teenager, but the eternal spiritual being created in the image and likeness of God. Christopher committed to the practice, though doubt plagued him constantly. He would sit in meditation and try to see his daughter as God saw her, whole, perfect, and free. His human mind screamed that this was nonsense, that he was wasting time while she remained in danger. But gradually something shifted in Christopher's consciousness. He began to experience a deep peace about his daughter, not because circumstances had changed, but because he had touched something eternal and unchangeable. He sensed her true being beneath the troubled surface appearance. This inner shift affected his interactions with his daughter profoundly. He stopped approaching her with fear and desperation. Instead, he related to her from a place of calm certainty about her fundamental goodness and worth. He no longer saw her as broken or damaged, but as temporarily confused about her true identity. His daughter noticed the change in her father immediately. The fear and disappointment she had always sensed in him had disappeared. In its place was something she had never experienced from him before, an unshakable confidence in her despite all evidence to the contrary. Goldsmith explained that this is how spiritual healing works. When we stop empowering the problem through fear and see only the spiritual reality, we create an atmosphere in which healing can occur. We are not trying to change the person or condition, but recognizing what is eternally true. Over the following months, Christopher's daughter gradually turned away from drugs. It was not a sudden miracle, but a steady transformation. She later told her father that his change had been crucial. When he stopped being afraid for her, she stopped believing she was someone to be afraid of. The study group grew as people experienced the power of these principles in their own lives. Joshua realized that understanding why Jesus said, "Fear not," was perhaps the most practical spiritual knowledge anyone could possess. It was not abstract theology, but a key to transformation in every area of life. He continued to study Goldsmith's works more deeply, discovering that this teacher had spent his entire life helping people understand the nature of spiritual consciousness. Goldsmith had experienced his own profound transformation and dedicated himself to sharing these truths with others. One teaching particularly struck Joshua. Goldsmith explained that Jesus never fought evil, disease, or lack. He simply failed to recognize them as real powers. He saw only God, only good, only spiritual perfection. This singular vision was the source of his power and peace. This was revolutionary for Joshua. He had spent his whole life fighting his fears, trying to overcome them through willpower or positive thinking. But Goldsmith taught a different way. Rather than fighting fear, we understand it has no foundation in spiritual reality. We see through it to the truth. Amanda, a schoolteacher, joined the group carrying years of anxiety about her own adequacy and worth. She constantly feared she was not good enough, not smart enough, not capable enough. This fear colored every interaction and decision in her life. Joshua introduced her to Goldsmith's teaching that we are not human beings trying to become spiritual. We are spiritual beings who have forgotten our true nature. Our worth is not earned through achievement or proven through performance. It is inherent in our existence as expressions of divine life. This idea was difficult for Amanda to accept. Her entire identity had been built around striving to prove her value. The suggestion that she was already complete, already worthy, already enough seemed too simple. Surely she had to do something to earn peace and self-acceptance. But Goldsmith taught that this very striving is what blocks us from experiencing our inherent wholeness. When we chase after what we already have, we perpetuate the illusion of lack. When we try to become what we already are, we deny our true identity. Amanda began practicing what Goldsmith called the art of meditation, which is simply resting in the awareness of God's presence. Not trying to achieve anything or become anything, but recognizing what is already true. In these moments, her anxiety would dissolve, replaced by profound peace. The transformation in Amanda was remarkable. As she released her need to prove her worth, she became more effective as a teacher. Her students responded to her newfound calm and confidence. Parents commented on the positive change in her classroom atmosphere. She realized that her previous anxiety had actually made her less capable, not more. Fear had clouded her judgment, blocked her creativity, and exhausted her energy. By understanding why Jesus said, "Fear not," She had accessed an inner resource that made her far more effective. Joshua watched these transformations with gratitude and wonder. He had stumbled upon Goldsmith's teaching in his own darkest moment, and it had changed everything. Now he was privileged to witness the same truth transforming others, each in their own unique way. The group studied Goldsmith's explanation of Jesus' statement, "My peace I give unto you, not as the world gives." The peace Jesus offered was not dependent on circumstances being favorable. It was the peace that comes from knowing the truth about God's presence and power. This peace was what Joshua's grandmother had possessed. It was what sustained Jesus in the boat during the storm. It was what enabled Christopher to remain calm about his daughter's struggle. It was a peace that transcended all understanding because it came from a dimension beyond human reasoning. Brian, a business executive, came to the group with a different kind of fear. He was terrified of failure, of losing his status and success. He worked constantly, driven by anxiety that if he relaxed for even a moment, everything would fall apart. His health was suffering, his marriage strained. Joshua shared Goldsmith's teaching that there is no spiritual law supporting failure or loss. Divine intelligence is always moving toward greater expression, greater good, greater fulfillment. When we align with this movement instead of trying to force outcomes through anxious effort, we work with spiritual law rather than against it. Brian found this counterintuitive. In his world, success came through aggressive action, constant vigilance, and competitive drive. The idea of relaxing into divine flow while trusting spiritual law seemed like a recipe for disaster. Yet he could not deny that his current approach was destroying him. He decided to experiment with a different way of working. Before each meeting or decision, he would take a moment to recognize divine intelligence present and available. He would affirm that the outcome was already established in spiritual reality, and his role was simply to be receptive to guidance. The results surprised him. His meetings became more productive, his decisions more sound. He felt a flow and ease he had never experienced. Most remarkably, his business results actually improved as he released the anxious striving that had dominated his professional life. If you're ready to learn more about living from this higher consciousness, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear this truth today. Brian shared his experience with the group, his voice filled with amazement. He said he had always thought fear was what kept him sharp and successful. He now realized fear had been his greatest handicap, limiting his vision and exhausting his resources. Joshua explained that this was precisely what Goldsmith meant when he taught about the principle of "my grace is sufficient." When we stop trying to accomplish everything through personal effort and instead become receptive to divine grace, we tap into an infinite resource. This grace is not something we must earn or deserve. It is the natural outpouring of divine love, always available, always sufficient for every need. Fear blocks our awareness of this grace, making us believe we must struggle alone with limited resources against overwhelming odds. The group discussed how prevalent this belief is in modern culture. We are taught that life is a struggle, that we must fight for everything, that only the strong and fearful enough to keep fighting will survive. This worldview guarantees perpetual anxiety and exhaustion. Jesus offered an entirely different paradigm. He lived from the consciousness that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, that divine good is immediately available, that we need only recognize and receive what is already given. This is why he could say, "Fear not," with such confidence. Lisa, a retired nurse, brought a question that many in the group had been wondering. If spiritual truth is so powerful and fear is truly powerless, why do bad things still happen? Why do people still suffer despite faith and spiritual practice? Joshua acknowledged the legitimacy and importance of this question. He shared Goldsmith's teaching that we live in a world where most people operate from material consciousness, believing in multiple powers and accepting fear as natural. This collective consciousness creates much of the suffering we see. However, as individuals awaken to spiritual truth and establish themselves in the consciousness of God's presence, they begin to experience a different reality. They are not immune to all challenges, but they navigate them with peace and often see them transformed or resolved in unexpected ways. More importantly, their suffering changes in nature. Even when facing difficulties, they maintain an inner stability and peace that makes the experience entirely different. They know that no material circumstance can touch their true spiritual being or separate them from God's love. Goldsmith taught that Jesus himself faced persecution and crucifixion, yet he went through it without fear, maintaining his consciousness of oneness with God throughout. He demonstrated that, even in the worst material circumstances, spiritual peace and power remain unshaken. The group continued meeting for months, and Joshua watched as lives transformed in remarkable ways. Not everyone's external circumstances changed dramatically, but everyone who committed to the practice experienced the lifting of fear's burden and the emergence of profound peace. He realized that this was Goldsmith's true gift to the world. The teacher had not promised that spiritual understanding would make life easy or problem-free. He had revealed something far more valuable, a way of living that transcends circumstances and remains unshaken regardless of appearances. Joshua began writing about his experience, hoping to reach others who were suffering under the weight of fear. He wrote about that desperate night when he first heard Goldsmith's voice explaining why Jesus said, "Fear not." He described the journey from terror to peace. The writing became a book, which he self-published with no expectations. But people began finding it and sharing it with others. The message resonated because fear is perhaps the most universal human experience. Everyone knows its crushing weight and desperate seeks relief. Through emails and messages, Joshua heard story after story of lives transformed by understanding the spiritual principles Goldsmith had taught. People were discovering that fear loses its power when we understand it has no foundation in spiritual truth, when we recognize that God alone is power and presence. One message particularly moved Joshua. It was from a woman named Michelle, whose son had been diagnosed with a terminal illness. She had found Joshua's book in her darkest hour and began applying Goldsmith's principles to her situation. She did not deny the medical diagnosis or refuse treatment, but she established herself in the spiritual truth that her son's eternal being was untouchable by disease. She recognized divine life as the only life, perfect and whole. She practiced seeing her son through God's eyes, not through the lens of fear. The shift in her consciousness affected the entire family. Where there had been despair and panic, peace emerged. Her son felt the change and responded to it. The medical team noticed something different in this family, a calm certainty that seemed to support the boy's healing process. Michelle's son went into remission, defying the doctor's predictions. But as she wrote to Joshua, the real miracle had been her liberation from fear. Even if circumstances had been different, she had discovered a peace that transcended outcomes, a foundation that no external event could shake. This was exactly what Goldsmith had taught. When we understand why Jesus said, "Fear not," we are not guaranteed specific material outcomes. We are given something infinitely more valuable, entrance into a consciousness where fear cannot exist, because we know the truth about God's presence and power. Joshua reflected on his journey from that desperate night to this moment of helping others discover the same truth. He saw clearly now that his job loss and financial crisis had been essential to his awakening. Comfort had kept him spiritually asleep. Desperation had opened him to a deeper reality. This is often how spiritual awakening occurs, Goldsmith had explained. When material solutions fail and human resources are exhausted, we become receptive to spiritual truth. Crisis can be the doorway to transformation if we are willing to look beyond material appearances to spiritual reality. The study group had grown beyond Joshua's apartment, and they now met in a rented space. New people arrived each week, each carrying their own burden of fear. Joshua welcomed them, knowing they were about to discover what he had discovered, a truth that would change everything. He always began with new members the same way, sharing his own story and then explaining Goldsmith's core teaching. When Jesus said, "Fear not," he was revealing that fear exists only when we believe we are separate from God, dependent on material circumstances, vulnerable to countless threatening powers. But spiritual truth knows only one power, one presence, one life. In the awareness of this truth, fear dissolves because its foundation disappears. We are not alone, not vulnerable, not dependent on material conditions for our well-being. We are eternal spiritual beings, forever held in divine love. Timothy arrived at the group in crisis. His marriage was ending, his business failing, his health deteriorating. He felt like everything in his life was collapsing simultaneously. The fear was so intense he could barely function, and he came to the group as a last resort. Joshua recognized the desperation because he had been there himself. He knew that Timothy was actually in the perfect position to discover spiritual truth because his reliance on material solutions was completely exhausted. There was nowhere to turn but inward, to the only source that never fails. Over the following weeks, Timothy learned to practice what Goldsmith called the tabernacle within. Several times each day, he would withdraw from appearances and dwell in the awareness of God's presence. He would recognize that despite all appearances to the contrary, divine order was establishing itself in his life. At first, this seemed like futile escapism while his world burned around him. But gradually, Timothy began to experience what Joshua and others had discovered. A deep peace emerged, entirely independent of his circumstances. In that peace, clarity and wisdom arose where before there had been only panic. Goldsmith had taught that this inner peace is not passive acceptance but the most powerful force in the universe. It is the atmosphere in which divine intelligence can work, in which solutions can appear, in which transformation becomes possible. Fear blocks this process, while peace enables it. Timothy's external circumstances did not all resolve immediately or easily. His marriage did end, though with far less acrimony than expected. His business required restructuring, but he found creative solutions he would never have seen through the fog of fear. His health began improving as stress decreased. More importantly, Timothy discovered that his sense of well-being no longer depended on any of these external factors. He had found something that could not be taken away, could not fail, could not disappoint. He had discovered his true foundation in spiritual reality. This was the ultimate meaning of Jesus' words, "Fear not." Not a command to suppress natural human emotions, but an invitation to discover the consciousness Jesus himself lived from. A consciousness where fear is impossible because we know ourselves to be inseparable from infinite good. The study group had become a community of people who had made this discovery. They came from different circumstances and backgrounds, but they shared a common experience. They had touched something real, something that transcended all material conditions, something that brought genuine peace. Joshua often thought about Goldsmith and the gift he had given the world. The teacher had spent his life illuminating these spiritual principles, helping people understand the practical implications of spiritual truth. His words had reached across time to save Joshua in his darkest hour. Years passed, and Joshua continued sharing what he had learned. His book reached more people, the study group continued to grow, and lives kept transforming. But he never lost sight of the simple truth at the heart of everything, the truth that had saved him. When we understand why Jesus said, "Fear not," we discover that fear is not overcome through courage or willpower. It dissolves through understanding. When we see clearly that God alone is power and presence, when we know ourselves to be inseparable from this infinite source, fear has no place to exist. This understanding must be renewed daily because the material world constantly contradicts it. Appearances suggest we are vulnerable, separate, dependent on favorable circumstances. The news, our bank accounts, our bodies, other people's opinions, all seem to confirm the reality of threat and danger. But spiritual truth remains unchanged by appearances. God is still the only power, still completely present, still expressing as infinite good. Our work is to remember this truth, to dwell in this awareness, to see from this consciousness rather than from the consciousness of fear. Joshua had discovered that this practice was not escape from reality, but engagement with true reality. The material world of appearances is the illusion. Spiritual truth is the reality. As we dwell in spiritual truth, even the appearance begins to reflect more harmony, more good, more of what we have always sought. On the anniversary of that desperate night when he first heard Goldsmith's voice, Joshua sat in quiet gratitude. He thought about all the people whose lives had been touched by this truth, all the fear that had been lifted, all the peace that had been discovered. He understood now that his grandmother's peace had not been mysterious or unattainable. She had simply understood what Jesus meant by "fear not." She had lived from the consciousness of God's presence, and that consciousness had sustained her through every circumstance. This same peace was available to everyone, not through special gifts or exceptional holiness, but through simple understanding. When we grasp that we are not separate from our source, that divine intelligence and love are always present and available, fear loses its foundation and power. Joshua looked at the group gathering for their weekly meeting. New faces mixed with familiar ones, all seeking the same thing, relief from fear's crushing weight. He knew that each person who truly understood these principles would go on to help others, creating an ever-widening circle of peace. This was Goldsmith's legacy and Jesus' gift to humanity, not a religion or philosophy to believe in, but a truth to be experienced. A truth that sets us free from fear and establishes us in the consciousness of infinite good. A truth that transforms everything when we finally understand why Jesus said, "Fear not." In that understanding lies the peace that surpasses all human comprehension, the peace that is our true nature and eternal inheritance. If this teaching has touched your heart, subscribe to this channel, leave a comment sharing your experience with fear, and join our community of spiritual seekers discovering the peace that Jesus promised. Jesus spoke 2 words that hold the entire secret of spiritual power. Not a prayer, not a request, not a hope. Just 2 words. I am. Most people rush past this statement thinking it's just a name, but Joel Goldsmith discovered something that changes everything. When you truly understand why Jesus said I am, you unlock a consciousness that dissolves problems without effort. The mystery isn't in the words themselves. It's in the consciousness behind them. When Jesus said I am, he wasn't identifying with a body or a personality. He was declaring the presence of God as his only identity. This wasn't philosophy. This was the ultimate healing principle that transformed water into wine and raised the dead through pure consciousness. You've been taught to seek God outside yourself, to pray to something distant, to beg for what you need. But the I am reveals a truth that shatters every limitation. God isn't something you reach for. God is the very I that you are. When you grasp this, everything in your life begins to shift. Not because you're doing more, but because you're understanding what has always been true. Joel Goldsmith spent decades discovering what Jesus really meant. He found that I am isn't a statement about your human self. It's not about your personality, your history, or your circumstances. The I am is the infinite presence expressing as you right now. When you say I am with spiritual awareness, you're not speaking as a limited person. You're speaking as consciousness itself. Think about how you use these words daily. I am sick, I am broke, I am afraid. Every time you attach I am to a condition, you're giving power to illusion. You're identifying the infinite with the finite. You're claiming that God, the I of your being, is limited by circumstances. This is the root of all suffering. Not what happens to you, but what you claim I am is. Jesus never said I am sick or I am lacking. He said I am the resurrection. I am the light. I am the way. He was identifying with the infinite, not the condition. When you begin to use I am only with truth, with what is eternal and unchanging, your entire experience begins to mirror that consciousness. This isn't positive thinking. This is spiritual law. Here's what Joel discovered that few teachers reveal. The I am isn't something you create or develop. It already is. You don't become the I am through practice or achievement. You simply stop identifying with what you are not. Every problem in your life exists because you've forgotten that the I that you are is God expressing. Not will be. Not can become. Yes, when you're facing illness, the temptation is to say, I am sick and I need healing. But the moment you claim I am sick, you've denied the truth of your being. The I that you are cannot be sick because that I is infinite spirit. The body may show symptoms, yes, but that's not the I. The I am is perfect, whole, complete. When you rest in this knowing, healing happens naturally. The same applies to every area of life. Not I am poor and need supply, but I am the infinite abundance of God made visible. Not I am alone and need love, but I am the presence of love itself. This isn't denial of circumstances. This is recognition of what lies beneath all circumstances. The eternal I that is your true identity, unchanged by any condition that appears in the world of form. Most spiritual teachings give you something to do. Visualize, affirm, manifest. But Jesus revealed something far more powerful. He revealed a state of being. I am is not an action. It's a recognition. When you truly understand this, you stop trying to get things from God and start realizing that God is already the substance of your being, expressing as your experience. This is why Joel taught that healing isn't about changing conditions, it's about changing identity. When you know yourself as the I am, the infinite presence, conditions have no choice but to align with that truth. You don't heal the body. You recognize that the I of your being was never sick. You don't create abundance. You recognize that the I am is infinite supply. Here's the transformation that happens when this understanding deepens. You stop living from the level of effect. You stop reacting to appearances. You rest in the I am, and from that resting place, every need is met, every problem dissolves, every fear vanishes. Not through struggle, but through spiritual recognition. This is the secret Jesus lived. This is what Joel spent his life teaching. Let me share what happened to a woman named Margaret who attended Joel's classes in the 1950s. She'd suffered with chronic pain for 7 years. Doctors found nothing wrong. She'd tried every treatment, every therapy, every healing method available. Nothing worked. She came to Joel desperate, exhausted, and ready to give up hope entirely. Joel didn't pray for her. He didn't treat her condition. He simply asked her one question: who is the I that says I am in pain? Margaret was confused at first. She said, I am. I'm the one suffering. But Joel pressed deeper. Is the I am you speak of capable of pain? Can infinite spirit hurt? Can God suffer? She sat in silence for nearly 20 minutes. Then something shifted in her consciousness. She realized she'd been identifying her true self, the I am, with a body and its sensations. The pain didn't belong to the I that she was. It belonged to a false sense of identity. Within 3 weeks, the pain began to diminish. Within 2 months, it was completely gone. Not because she fought it, but because she stopped claiming it as her identity. A businessman named Robert used this same principle with his failing company. He was on the edge of bankruptcy, drowning in debt, watching everything he'd built crumble. Every morning he'd wake up thinking, I am failing, I am losing everything. His prayers were desperate pleas for God to save his business, to send customers, to provide a miracle from outside himself. Then Robert heard Joel speak about the I am. He realized he'd been claiming lack as his identity. He'd been saying, I am broke, instead of recognizing that the I of his being is infinite supply. He began a daily practice. Every morning before looking at numbers or emails, he'd sit quietly and recognize, I am is the abundance of God. I am is infinite resource. I am is divine intelligence expressing. It took 4 months, not 4 days. But slowly, ideas came. Connections appeared. Opportunities opened that had been invisible before. His business didn't just survive. It transformed into something more aligned with his true purpose. The change wasn't in his circumstances first. It was in his consciousness. When he stopped identifying with lack, abundance had space to flow through him naturally. Joel worked with a mother whose son was addicted to drugs. She'd prayed for years. She'd begged God to change her son. She'd tried intervention, therapy, tough love, enabling, everything. Nothing worked. Her son kept using, kept disappearing, kept breaking her heart. She came to Joel exhausted, guilt-ridden, desperate for someone to fix her child. Joel told her something that shocked her. Stop praying for your son to change. Stop seeing him as an addict. Stop identifying him with his condition. Instead, recognize the truth. Your son's real identity is I am, the presence of God. That presence cannot be addicted. That presence is whole, free, and perfect right now. See only that truth, regardless of what appears. She practiced this for 6 months. Some days her son seemed worse. but she held to the truth of his being, not the appearance of his behavior. She stopped mothering the addiction and started recognizing the Christ. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, something shifted in him. He entered treatment on his own. He stayed. Today, years later, he's free. Not because she changed him, but because she stopped empowering the false identity. These stories aren't exceptions. They're examples of spiritual law in action. When you stop identifying with conditions and start identifying with the I am, your true nature, reality must conform to that recognition. This isn't magic. This isn't wishful thinking. This is how consciousness works. What you claim as your identity becomes your experience. Joel taught that the great barrier to healing and transformation is personal sense. The belief that you are a separate person with personal problems needing personal solutions. But the I am has no personal problems. The I am is infinite, perfect, whole. When you rest in that identity, even for moments, the personal sense with all its troubles begins to dissolve. Here's the practice Joel gave his students. Throughout your day, whenever fear or lack or pain appears, pause. Ask yourself, who is experiencing this? Is it the I am, or is it the false sense of personal self? Then gently return to the truth. I am is the presence of God. I am is whole. I am is supplied. Don't fight the condition. Simply withdraw your identification from it. If these transformation stories inspire you and you're beginning to see the power of true identity, like this video to help others discover these teachings, subscribe for more. Joel Goldsmith Wisdom, and comment. Which story of consciousness transformation resonated most deeply with your own spiritual journey? Now let's go deeper into how you actually live from this consciousness. Understanding I am intellectually doesn't transform your life. You must practice it until it becomes your natural state of being. Joel called this practicing the presence. Not thinking about God, not praying to God, but recognizing that the I of your being is God, right here, right now, in this moment. Start with the smallest moments. When you wake up, before your mind fills with problems and tasks, recognize, I am awake. Not a person waking to face another difficult day, but I am, infinite consciousness, expressing as this experience. When you eat, recognize, I am sustained by infinite substance. When you work, recognize, I am is the intelligence accomplishing this task. This isn't affirmation. Affirmations try to make something true. This is recognition of what already is true. The difference is profound. Affirmations come from lack, trying to create what you don't have. Recognition comes from wholeness, acknowledging what has always been present. One struggles, the other rests. One seeks, the other realizes. Joel taught a specific technique for moments of crisis or intense challenge. He called it the pause. When fear grips you, when pain overwhelms you, when circumstances seem impossible, you pause everything. You don't react. You don't try to solve. You don't panic. You pause and return to the I am. This simple act interrupts the false identity and opens space for truth. In the pause, you ask, what is the truth of my being right now? Not what appears, but what is eternally true. The truth is always the same. I am is the presence of God, untouched by any condition. I am is whole. I am is supplied. I am is safe. Not because circumstances prove it, but because this is the nature of infinite being expressing as you. A woman used this during a medical crisis. Her doctor found a mass and scheduled immediate surgery. Terror consumed her, but she remembered the pause. Every time fear arose, she stopped. She didn't deny the situation or fight the fear. She simply returned to truth. I am is perfect life. I am cannot be threatened. By the time of her pre-surgery scan, the mass had vanished completely. Another powerful practice Joel taught is releasing judgment. Every time you judge yourself or others, you're operating from personal sense, not I am consciousness. The I am doesn't judge because the I am recognizes only itself in all. When you see someone struggling, you're not seeing their true identity. You're seeing a false sense of separation appearing as a person with problems. This doesn't mean ignoring behavior or boundaries. It means seeing beyond the appearance to the truth. When someone wrongs you, the human reaction is anger, hurt, judgment. But from I am consciousness, you recognize this person's true identity is also I am, the presence of God. They've forgotten, just as you've forgotten at times. This recognition doesn't condone wrong action. It heals the consciousness behind it. Practice this with yourself first. When you fail, when you make mistakes, when you fall short of your ideals, stop the self-judgment. That judgment is personal sense attacking personal sense. Instead, return to truth. The I that you are never failed because the I am is perfect. The mistake happened in the dream of personal identity. Wake up to your real self and begin again from wholeness. The third essential practice is what Joel called impersonal supply. You've been taught that supply comes from jobs, people, investments, sources outside yourself. This creates fear. What if the source dries up? What if you lose the job? What if the person leaves? But when you understand that I am is infinite supply, you realize source is never outside you. Your employer isn't your source. Your clients aren't your source. Your investments aren't your source. I am is your source, and that source is infinite, never-ending, always flowing. The channels may change. One job may end and another begin. One stream of income may dry up while 3 others open. But the source, the I am, never diminishes, never fails, never runs out. Live from this knowing. When you pay bills, recognize I am is infinite supply making itself visible. When you work, recognize I am is the substance of my abundance. When you give, recognize I am gives from infinite fullness, not from personal limitation. This consciousness attracts supply through unexpected channels, synchronistic opportunities, and ways you could never have planned or manipulated into being. But let's be honest about the challenges. Knowing this truth and living it consistently are different things. You'll have moments where you forget completely, where fear overwhelms the truth, where circumstances seem so real, so pressing, so urgent that I am consciousness feels like fantasy. Joel experienced this too. Every spiritual teacher has. This is normal. This is part of the journey. The first challenge is when nothing seems to change. You practice, you recognize, you identify as I am, and your circumstances remain the same. The illness continues. The lack persists. The problem doesn't dissolve. Your mind screams, this doesn't work. You're fooling yourself. You need to take action, to do something, to fix it the old way through human effort and struggle. Joel's answer was simple but not easy. Spiritual realization works in consciousness first, not in conditions. Sometimes the inner shift happens quickly and outer change follows immediately. Sometimes the inner work takes weeks or months of consistent practice before you see evidence in the physical. Your job isn't to make things happen. Your job is to know the truth and remain faithful to it, regardless of appearances. The second challenge is other people's reactions. When you start living from I am consciousness, you become different. You stop complaining. You stop participating in fear-based conversations. You stop agreeing that circumstances are terrible and hopeless. Some people will think you're in denial. Others will think you've joined a cult. Some will actively try to pull you back into agreement with limitation. A man in Joel's classes lost friends when he stopped engaging in their constant complaints about money, health, and politics. They thought he didn't care. They accused him of being cold, disconnected, superior. But he wasn't judging them. He simply couldn't participate in claiming lack and limitation as truth anymore. He had to choose, comfort of agreement or integrity of consciousness. This is your choice too. You cannot live in two worlds. You cannot claim I am is infinite abundance in meditation and then spend your day agreeing with everyone that times are hard and money is scarce. You cannot recognize I am is perfect health in prayer and then spend hours discussing symptoms and diseases. Choose your consciousness carefully because it's choosing your experience. The third challenge is impatience. You want transformation now. You want healing today. You want abundance this week. But consciousness unfolds at its own pace. A seed doesn't become a tree overnight. The invisible work happens first. Roots go deep before the shoot appears above ground. Your consistent practice is the root work. Trust that something is happening even when you see no evidence. Joel worked with a man whose business was failing for 2 years. He practiced I am consciousness every day. Some months seemed better, then worse again. He was tempted to give up the practice and return to human struggle and manipulation, but something kept him faithful. In the third year, everything shifted, not gradually but suddenly. Opportunities exploded, money flowed, the business tripled. Later he understood why. The first 2 years were preparing his consciousness. He was learning to truly rest in I am, instead of anxiously trying to make things happen from personal effort. When his consciousness was finally clear, when he truly knew himself as infinite supply, the outer world had no choice but to mirror that knowing. The delay wasn't punishment. It was preparation for a blessing his old consciousness couldn't have sustained. The fourth challenge is mixing practices. You try I am consciousness for a week. Nothing happens fast enough, so you add visualization techniques, then affirmations, then manifestation rituals, then you ask others to pray for you. You mix truth with methods that operate from lack. This creates confusion in consciousness. You're saying I am is complete while simultaneously acting like you need something outside yourself. Joel was firm about this. You cannot serve two masters. Either I am is your sufficiency or it isn't. Either God is the substance of your being or you need to manipulate conditions. Either you trust spiritual identity or you trust human effort. Mixing the two cancels both. Choose one path and commit to it completely, especially when fear screams at you to hedge your bets. Here's how to navigate these challenges. First, give yourself grace. You're unlearning lifetimes of false identity. Second, return to truth without guilt when you forget. Third, find even one person who understands this consciousness. Joel's students supported each other through doubt. Fourth, measure progress by your inner peace, not outer conditions. Peace in the midst of challenge proves consciousness is shifting. If these insights about overcoming consciousness challenges speak to your heart and you're ready to commit to this path, like this video to support authentic spiritual teaching, subscribe for advanced practices in Joel Goldsmith wisdom, and comment. Which challenge are you facing right now and ready to transform through I am consciousness? Let's explore advanced applications of I am consciousness in specific life areas. First, relationships. Most relationship problems come from seeking completion in another person. You feel incomplete, so you look for someone to fill the emptiness. You feel unloved, so you need someone to love you. But this places impossible demands on human relationships and guarantees disappointment. When you recognize I am is infinite love, the nature of your being, everything changes. You're not seeking love. You're expressing the love you are. You don't need completion from another. You're already whole. Relationships become sharing of wholeness rather than trading of neediness. This doesn't mean you don't desire partnership. It means you desire it from fullness, not from lack. A woman practiced this after 3 failed marriages. She stopped looking for someone to make her happy and started recognizing I am is infinite love and joy. For a year, she focused only on knowing herself as complete. Then she met someone. But this relationship was different. No desperation, no clinging, no fear of loss. Just 2 whole people choosing to share life. That marriage is thriving 20 years later because it's built on truth, not need. Second, health. Medical treatment has its place, but I am consciousness reveals something deeper. Your body isn't your identity. The I am you are is pure spirit, perfect life, incapable of disease. This doesn't mean denying symptoms or refusing care. It means not identifying with the condition. You have a body showing symptoms. You are not those symptoms. The I that you are is eternally whole. Joel healed himself of tuberculosis through this understanding. Doctors said he had months to live, but he refused to claim the disease as his identity. He didn't fight it or fear it. He simply rested in the knowing, I am is perfect life. The disease has nothing to do with my true identity. His body healed completely, and he lived decades beyond the doctor's prognosis, teaching this principle to thousands. Practice this with any health challenge. Don't say I am sick. Say the body is showing symptoms, but I am is whole. Don't identify with the diagnosis. Recognize that diagnosis describes a condition in matter, but your true self is spirit, untouched by material conditions. Work with doctors, take medicine if needed, but know these are aids for the body. Your real healing comes from recognizing what you truly are. Third, your work and purpose. Most people see their job as how they survive. They trade time and energy for money. They endure work they hate because they need income. But I Am consciousness transforms work from survival into expression. The work you do becomes how infinite intelligence and creativity flow into visible form. Not work you must do, but work you're designed to do. When you recognize I Am is infinite intelligence, you stop forcing. You stop trying to figure everything out through limited human thinking. You pause, you recognize the I Am, and you allow ideas to flow from that infinite source. The right work finds you. The right opportunities appear. The right people cross your path, not through networking and manipulation, but through spiritual alignment. A teacher felt trapped in her job for 15 years. She knew she was meant for something else, but couldn't see what or how. She began practicing I Am consciousness. She stopped trying to plan her escape and started recognizing, I Am is divine intelligence knowing exactly what I'm here to express. Within 6 months, an opportunity appeared that was perfect. She transitioned naturally into work that fed her soul and doubled her income. Fourth, dealing with enemies or difficult people. Jesus said, love your enemies. Most think that's impossible or naive. But from I Am consciousness, it makes perfect sense. The person attacking you isn't your enemy. They're the infinite I Am who has forgotten their identity. When you see past their behavior to their true nature, you're not condoning wrong action. You're recognizing reality beneath appearance. This is practical, not sentimental. A man had a business partner who betrayed him, stole clients, spread lies. Human reaction is revenge, anger, hatred. But this man practiced I Am consciousness. He didn't pretend the betrayal didn't hurt. But he refused to see his partner as an enemy. He recognized, this person's true identity is I Am, just confused and operating from fear right now. The result was astonishing. As he held this consciousness, refusing to engage in hatred or revenge, something shifted. His former partner's schemes began to fail. The lies were exposed without the man saying a word. Within a year, the partner reached out and apologized, making full restitution. Not because the man manipulated or planned it, because consciousness operating from truth is more powerful than all human scheming operating from falsehood. Now we're ready for the ultimate integration. Living as I Am isn't something you do during meditation or when problems arise. It becomes your constant state. You wake as I Am. You walk as I Am. You work as I Am. You love as I Am. You rest as I Am. Every experience becomes the infinite expressing in finite form. You're no longer a person trying to be spiritual. You're spirit appearing as person. This doesn't make you perfect in behavior. You'll still make mistakes, still have preferences, still experience the full range of human emotion. But underneath it all, you know what you are. A wave still looks like a wave, moves like a wave, has its unique shape. But it never forgets its ocean. You're the wave that knows itself as the infinite sea, expressing in this particular form. Joel lived this way. People around him felt something different. Not superiority or detachment, but presence. When he entered a room, consciousness shifted. When he spoke, people's problems often dissolved without him directly addressing them. Why? Because he lived so consistently from I Am consciousness that it radiated from him, lifting everyone near him into that same recognition without words. You can live this way too, not by trying to be like Joel, not by imitating his words or methods, but by practicing what he taught until the I Am becomes your living reality. Start today, right now. Whatever you're facing, whatever challenge or fear or need is pressing on you, pause. Stop trying to solve it humanly. Stop seeing yourself as a person with a problem. Return to truth. Recognize, I Am is the only presence and power. I Am is whole. I Am is supplied. I Am is safe. I Am is loved. Not because conditions prove it, but because this is the eternal nature of being. You're not trying to become this. You're recognizing what you already are. This recognition isn't escape from reality. This recognition is reality. Everything else is the dream of separation appearing temporarily in consciousness. As this becomes your foundation, watch what happens. Not overnight, not magically, but steadily, consistently, powerfully. Problems that seemed impossible begin to dissolve. Needs you struggled to meet begin to be fulfilled through unexpected channels. Relationships that were painful begin to heal or gracefully end. Health that was failing begins to restore. Not because you made it happen, because you stopped blocking it with false identity. Joel Goldsmith left you an incredible gift. Not a religion, not a set of rules, not a system to follow perfectly. He left you the key to the kingdom that Jesus taught. That key is recognizing what the words "I am" truly mean. When Jesus said, "I am the resurrection and the life," he wasn't claiming something special for himself alone. He was revealing what every human being truly is beneath the costume of personality. You are not your name. You are not your history. You are not your circumstances. You are not your body, your bank account, your relationships, your achievements, or your failures. All of these are experiences flowing through consciousness. But the I that is aware of all these experiences, the I that existed before any of these conditions appeared and will exist after they all change, that I is God expressing as your individuality. This is why Jesus could heal, could multiply loaves and fishes, could walk on water, could rise from death. Not because he was different from you in essence, because he knew what he was and never forgot it. He lived completely from I am consciousness. And he said, "These things you will do also, and greater things." Not might do if you're special. Will do when you understand what you are. This is your invitation and your destiny. So what happens when you truly understand why Jesus said, "I am"? Everything changes. Your problems don't all vanish in one moment. Your life doesn't become perfect tomorrow, but something shifts at the core of your being. You stop living from fear and lack. You stop identifying with conditions. You stop seeking outside yourself for what you already are. You rest in the infinite presence that you've always been. From this resting place, transformation flows naturally. Healing happens without effort. Supply appears without strain. Relationships align without manipulation. Purpose unfolds without forcing. Not because you've gained something new, but because you've remembered something ancient. You've remembered that the I of your being is the I of God, one infinite presence expressing uniquely as you. This is Joel Goldsmith's greatest teaching. This is Jesus' ultimate revelation. This is the secret hidden in plain sight in two simple words that contain all power, all healing, all supply, all love, all life. I am, not will be, not should be, not trying to be. Simply, eternally, completely, I am. Live from this knowing and watch your entire world transform from the inside out. If your understanding of spiritual identity has been transformed forever through these Joel Goldsmith teachings, like this video to help others discover their true nature. Subscribe for more profound consciousness wisdom, and comment, "I am," to claim your recognition of the infinite presence you truly are right now.
What happens when you truly understand you are my friend's introduction? The statement that changes everything. Imagine for a moment that you've worked for someone for years. You've followed their instructions, completed their tasks, met their expectations. The relationship is professional, respectful, even warm, but there's a distance, a gap between employee and employer, between the one who commands and the one who obeys. Then one day everything changes. Your employer looks at you and says, "I no longer call you my employee. I call you my friend." What just happened? The entire foundation of your relationship shifted, the rules changed, the expectations transformed, your identity in that relationship was fundamentally redefined. This is precisely what happens in one of the most overlooked yet revolutionary statements in human history. When the words "you are my friends" were spoken, they weren't just pleasantries or kind sentiments. They were a declaration that shattered the existing order and introduced a completely new paradigm for how we relate to the divine. But here's the problem. Most people have heard these words without truly understanding them. They've read past them, nodded in agreement, maybe even felt a warm feeling. But they haven't stopped long enough to let the full weight of this statement crush their old understanding and rebuild it into something entirely new. What happens when you truly understand you are my friends? Everything changes. Your prayers change, your obedience changes, your suffering changes, your purpose changes, your confidence changes, your very identity undergoes a metamorphosis that cannot be undone. In the next few minutes, we're going to explore what it really means when these words move from your head to your heart, from information to transformation. We'll unpack 4 massive shifts that occur when you genuinely comprehend this statement, and we'll discover why this single truth has the power to revolutionize every aspect of your spiritual life. Because once you truly understand that you are called friend, not servant, not employee, not even devoted follower, but friend, you can never go back to the old way of relating to God. The game has changed forever. Understanding the radical shift from servants to friends, to grasp the magnitude of this statement, we need to understand what's actually being said. In the ancient world, the distinction between a servant and a friend wasn't just semantic. It was a chasm that defined every aspect of the relationship. A servant's job was simple: obey. Do what you're told, follow orders, don't ask why. The servant doesn't need to understand the master's reasoning, motivation, or ultimate plans. The servant just needs to know the next instruction and carry it out faithfully. The relationship is transactional. The master gives commands, the servant executes them. There's no expectation of intimacy, no sharing of confidences, no mutual understanding of hearts. In that world, this was the expected, normal, and even honored relationship between humans and the divine. You served the gods, you made the sacrifices, you performed the rituals, you followed the rules. But you didn't presume to be intimate with them. You didn't expect to understand their ways. You certainly didn't consider yourself their friend. The distance was the point. The hierarchy was the foundation. The separation was sacred. Then comes this statement: I no longer call you servants, I call you friends. Do you hear the earthquake in those words? This isn't a minor adjustment or a gentle upgrade. This is a complete demolition of the old paradigm and the construction of something that had never existed before in human religious experience. The servant-master relationship is being voluntarily dissolved by the master himself, the one with all the power, all the authority, all the right to demand obedience, is choosing to step down from that position, not to abdicate authority, but to invite into something far more profound. Friendship in the ancient world meant equality of affection, if not of position. It meant shared purposes and shared secrets. It meant loyalty that went both directions. It meant that both parties had access to each other's hearts, thoughts, and plans. When a master called a servant friend, everything changed. The commands didn't stop, but they were now given in a completely different context. The service didn't end, but it was now motivated by something entirely different. The relationship didn't become less structured, but it became infinitely more intimate. This is what's being offered in those simple words: you are my friends. It's an invitation out of the transaction and into intimacy, out of mere duty and into shared purpose, out of the distance of religious obligation and into the closeness of divine friendship. But here's what most people miss: this isn't automatic. The invitation is extended, but it must be accepted. The words are spoken, but they must be believed and embraced. And when you truly understand and accept this new identity, 4 massive shifts occur that transform everything about how you live in relationship with God. Let's explore what actually happens when these words move from being a nice theological concept to becoming your lived reality. You are known completely, and it's no longer terrifying. The first thing that happens when you truly understand you are my friends is that you realize friendship requires complete transparency, and surprisingly, this stops being terrifying and starts being liberating. Think about the servant-master dynamic. The servant only shows the master what the master needs to see to accomplish the work. You present your best self. You hide your struggles, your doubts, your failures. You wear the mask of competence and devotion. The master doesn't need to know about your internal battles, your secret sins, your hidden questions. The master just needs to see results. Many people approach their relationship with God this way. They show up with their Sunday best, not just in clothing but in spirit. They pray the prayers that sound holy. They confess the sins that seem acceptable to confess. They present the version of themselves that seems most deserving of God's approval. But friendship doesn't work that way. Friendship requires knowing and being known. Real friends see behind the mask. They know your failures and love you anyway. They hear your doubts and don't reject you. They witness your struggles and step closer, not further away. When you truly understand you are my friends, something shifts in your spirit. You realize that the pretense has to go, not because you'll be punished for dropping it, but because friendship cannot exist where hiding exists. And here's where it gets beautiful. You begin to understand that God already knows everything you've been trying to hide. The mask you've been wearing, He's always seen through it. The sins you've been concealing, He's known about them all along. The doubts you've been ashamed to voice, He's heard them in your heart before you even formed the words. The question isn't whether God knows you completely. He does. He always has. The question is whether you're willing to stop pretending that He doesn't. When you embrace your identity as a friend of God, you stop the exhausting performance. You come before Him with your real questions, not just the ones that sound spiritual. You confess your actual struggles, not just the socially acceptable ones. You bring your authentic self, broken, confused, sometimes angry, often afraid, and you discover that this is exactly who He wanted to see all along. This is what friends do. They let each other see the truth, and in that vulnerability something miraculous happens. The relationship deepens. The fear that drove the hiding begins to dissolve, replaced by a trust that can only come from being fully known and still fully loved. You start praying differently. Instead of carefully crafted prayers that sound impressive, you have conversations. You complain, you question, you cry, you laugh. You're honest about your frustration when prayers seem unanswered, and your confusion when God's ways don't make sense. And you discover that He's not offended by this. Friends aren't offended by honesty, they're offended by pretense. This first shift from hiding to being known is foundational to everything else, because you cannot truly be someone's friend if you're constantly performing for them. You cannot experience the depth of divine friendship if you're always trying to manage God's perception of you. When you understand you are my friends, you lay down the mask, and in that moment of radical vulnerability, you discover what you've been looking for all along. Acceptance not because you've hidden your flaws well, but despite the fact that every flaw is fully visible. You are known completely, and it's no longer terrifying. It's home. You are trusted with everything, the divine confidence. The second massive shift that occurs when you truly understand you are my friends is the realization that friends share their hearts, their plans, and their purposes. You're no longer just following orders. You're being trusted with the why behind everything. There's a statement that accompanies the declaration of friendship, and it's just as revolutionary. I've called you friends. For everything that I learned from my Father, I have made known to you. Stop and think about what this means. In a servant-master relationship, the master doesn't owe the servant an explanation. The servant doesn't need to know the master's reasoning, strategy, or ultimate goals. The servant just needs to know, do this, and that's enough. But friends get the full story. Friends are brought into the inner circle. Friends are trusted with the confidences, the plans, the heart behind the actions. When God says, I've made everything known to you, he's saying, I'm not keeping secrets from you, I'm not holding back, I'm giving you access to my heart, my purposes, my understanding. This is staggering. The God of the universe, the creator of all things, is saying he trusts you with his thoughts. He's inviting you into divine confidence. He's making you a partner in understanding, not just a participant in action. When you truly grasp this, your entire approach to understanding God's will transforms. You're no longer just trying to figure out what he wants you to do next. You're seeking to understand his heart, his character, his purposes in the world. You're not just asking, what should I do? You're asking, what are you doing and how do I fit into that? This shift changes how you read Scripture. You're no longer just looking for rules to follow or promises to claim. You're listening for the heart of God. You're seeking to understand his nature, his values, his grand narrative of redemption. You're reading as someone who has been invited to understand, not just to obey. This shift changes how you discern his leading in your life. You're not just looking for clear instructions or signs. You're cultivating a relationship where you're beginning to understand how he thinks, what he values, what matters to him. And from that understanding, decisions become clearer. Not because you get a divine memo for every choice, but because you know your friend well enough to understand what would align with his heart and what wouldn't. This is the privilege of friendship. You get to know the why. When difficult things happen, you're invited to understand God's purposes, not always immediately, not always completely, but far more than a servant would ever be privileged to know. When he asks you to do something that doesn't make sense, you have access to ask questions, to seek understanding, to wrestle with the purposes behind the command. But here's the crucial part. This trust is reciprocal. If God is trusting you with his heart, with his plans, with his purposes, then friendship also means you begin to trust him with yours. You share your dreams with him, not just your dutiful prayers. You bring your ideas to him, not just your requests for approval. You collaborate with him in the work he's doing in the world. This is the second shift. You move from blind obedience to informed partnership. You're not following orders from a distant commander. You're working alongside a friend who has made his purposes known to you and invited you to participate with full understanding. And this changes everything about how you engage in the Christian life. You're not just doing religious activities because you're supposed to. You're participating in a grand purpose that has been shared with you, that you understand, that you've been trusted to steward. You are not in the dark. You've been brought into the light, not because you earned it, but because that's what friends do. They trust each other with what matters most. You move from obligation to love, the freedom of friendship. The third profound shift that happens when you truly understand you are my friends is perhaps the most liberating. You move from the motivation of obligation to the motivation of love. And this changes not just what you do, but why you do it. In a servant-master relationship, the primary motivation is duty. You serve because you have to. You obey because it's required. You follow the commands because that's what servants do. There may be respect, there may even be affection, but the underlying driver is obligation. You serve because of your position, not primarily because of your heart. And here's what's subtle and dangerous about this. You can serve God faithfully for years out of obligation and never realize that something is missing. You can check all the boxes, follow all the rules, do all the right things, and live an entire life of dutiful religious service without ever experiencing the joy that comes from doing it all because you love Him. When you truly understand you are my friends, everything shifts from obligation to love, and the difference is cosmic. Love doesn't serve because it has to, it serves because it wants to. Love doesn't obey out of fear of consequences, it obeys because it trusts that the one giving the command has your best interest at heart. Love doesn't do religious activities to maintain status, it engages because the relationship itself is the reward. Think about the difference in your own human relationships. When you do something for someone out of obligation, because you're supposed to, because people will judge you if you don't, because it's expected, the action may be identical to doing it out of love, but the experience is completely different. Obligation is heavy, love is light. Obligation drains you, love energizes you. Obligation makes you watch the clock, love makes you lose track of time. This is what changes when you embrace your identity as a friend of God. The commands don't go away. Friends can still give each other direction, wisdom, and even instruction. But the context in which you receive those commands is completely transformed. When God asks you to forgive someone who hurt you, it's no longer just a religious requirement you have to grit your teeth and fulfill. It's your friend asking you to participate in the kind of grace-filled life He's inviting you into because He knows it will free you. When He calls you to generosity, it's not just a tithe obligation to avoid being cursed. It's your friend inviting you to experience the joy of open-handed living because He knows what greed does to the soul. This shift from obligation to love doesn't mean everything becomes easy. Love actually asks more of us than obligation ever could. But it asks from a completely different posture. Obligation says, you must. Love says, will you? And that tiny difference changes everything. When you're operating out of obligation, you're always measuring. Have I done enough? Have I met the requirement? Can I check this box? But when you're operating out of love, the questions change. How can I honor this relationship? What would bring joy to my friend? How can I participate more fully in what he's doing? This is the freedom of friendship. You're free from the burden of trying to earn approval. Your friend already delights in you. You're free from the fear of punishment for failure. Friends extend grace. You're free from the exhausting performance of religious duty. Love casts out that kind of fear. But you're not free to do whatever you want. You're bound by love, which is a much stronger bond than obligation ever was. Love constrains us more than duty, but it does so gladly. You find yourself wanting to please God, not because you're afraid of Him, but because you love Him. This third shift, from obligation to love, is the one that brings joy back into the relationship. It's what transforms Christianity from a burden to bear into a life to be embraced. It's what makes obedience stop feeling like loss and start feeling like gain. When you truly understand you are my friends, you stop asking, what do I have to do? And start asking, what do I get to do? That little shift in preposition represents a revolution in the soul. You share in the mission, partnership, not employment. The fourth and final massive shift that occurs when you truly understand you are my friends is that you move from being employed to being partnered. You're no longer just carrying out assignments, you're co-laboring in a shared mission. This is perhaps the most empowering shift of all. Servants execute the master's plan, friends help shape it. Now, to be clear, we're not talking about dictating to God or somehow becoming his equal. The friendship between humanity and divinity always maintains the appropriate distinction. He is still God, and we are still human. But within that relationship, there's a stunning dignity being offered. You're being invited to participate in the work of God in the world, not as a hired hand, but as a partner. Think about the difference. When you're an employee, you're given a job description, you fulfill your role, you complete your tasks, you do what you're assigned, and when you're done, you've accomplished your purpose. The vision belongs to the employer, the success belongs to the employer. You're just a cog in someone else's machine. But when you're a partner, everything changes. You have ownership in the vision. You contribute ideas. Your gifts and passions actually shape what the work looks like. You're not just executing someone else's plan, you're helping create it. The success is shared, the work is collaborative. This is what God is offering in the statement, "You are my friends." He's saying, I'm not just giving you a task to complete. I'm inviting you into my mission in the world, and I want you to bring your full self, your creativity, your passion, your unique gifting, your personality, into this work. When you truly understand this, it revolutionizes your sense of calling and purpose. You're no longer trying to figure out what religious job you're supposed to do. You're discovering how the unique way God made you fits into the grand work He's doing in the world. Your gifts aren't just nice bonuses, they're tools God has specifically equipped you with because He wants you to use them in partnership with Him. Your personality isn't something to be suppressed to become more spiritual. It's part of how God designed you to uniquely reflect His image and accomplish His purposes. This shift means you stop waiting for perfect clarity on every decision and start taking initiative. Partners don't just wait for instructions. They see needs and meet them. They see opportunities and seize them. They create and innovate and contribute. When you're God's friend and partner, you have the freedom and responsibility to use wisdom, creativity, and discernment to act. This is why mature Christians often talk about God's will in ways that seem confusing to new believers. They're not getting special divine memos for every decision. They've moved into a partnership where they understand the heart of God well enough to make decisions that align with His purposes, trusting that He's invited them into this kind of co-laboring relationship. But partnership also means sharing in the struggle. Friends don't just share the victories, they share the battles. When you understand you're God's friend and partner, you begin to see that the opposition you face isn't random. You're engaged in a mission that matters, and missions that matter always face resistance. This shift helps you understand suffering differently. You're not being randomly afflicted by a distant deity. You're sharing in the struggle of a work that you and your friend are doing together. Your pain has purpose because it's connected to a mission you're partnering in. This also means your work in the world, whatever it is, takes on sacred significance. You're not dividing your life between sacred religious activity and secular work. Everything becomes sacred when you understand you're partnering with God in the renewal of all things. Your job, your family, your creative work, your service to your community, it's all part of the partnership. When you truly understand you are my friends, you stop seeing yourself as a mere foot soldier in God's army and start seeing yourself as a trusted partner in the greatest enterprise in history, the redemption and restoration of all things. How this changes everything. So what does this actually look like when it moves from theology to Tuesday afternoon, when the concept of being God's friend becomes the reality you live in? First, this changes how you pray. Prayer stops being primarily about presenting requests to a cosmic vending machine and becomes conversation with a friend. You still bring your needs. Friends do that. But you also just talk. You share your day. You process your thoughts. You ask questions. You listen. Prayer becomes less formal and more intimate, less about getting the words right and more about being real. You pray with more boldness because you're talking to a friend who has invited this kind of access. But you also pray with more humility because you understand you're in relationship with someone who loves you enough to sometimes say no to your requests because he sees what you can't. Second, this changes how you obey. Obedience stops being grudging submission and becomes eager response. When your friend asks you to do something, even something hard, you do it differently than when a master commands it. You trust that he's asking because he knows it's best, not because he's trying to control you. And when you fail, because you will fail, you come back to him differently. You don't hide in shame or fear punishment. You come honestly, knowing that friends extend grace and help you grow. Third, this changes how you suffer. When difficulty comes, you don't immediately assume God is punishing you or has abandoned you. Friends walk through hard things together. You understand that he's with you in the suffering, that your pain matters to him, and that somehow even this is part of the partnership you share. You can be honest about the pain, you can question, you can even express anger or confusion, because that's what friends do when life doesn't make sense. The invitation still stands. We've explored 4 massive shifts that occur when you truly understand you are my friends. You realize you're completely known and it's no longer terrifying. You're trusted with everything, the divine confidence. You move from obligation to love as your motivation, and you become a partner in the mission, not just an employee. But here's what you need to understand. All of this is already available to you. The invitation has been extended. The words have been spoken. The offer stands. The question is, will you accept it? Because you can hear these words your whole life and never truly embrace them. You can nod in agreement with the theology, but continue living as a servant rather than a friend. You can know about this truth without knowing this truth. What would it look like for you to actually accept your identity as a friend of God? What would shift in your life if you truly believed that he knows you completely, trusts you fully, loves you genuinely, and wants to partner with you in his work in the world? Maybe it starts with prayer today. Not the formal kind, the honest kind. The kind where you come to God and say, I've been living as a servant when you've been calling me a friend. I want to accept that invitation. I want to know you the way friends know each other. I want to be known by you without the mask. I want to understand your heart. I want to love you, not just obey you. I want to partner with you in what you're doing. That prayer changes everything, because the moment you embrace your identity as God's friend, you can never go back to merely being his servant. The relationship has been transformed. The paradigm has shifted. Everything is different now. You are his friend, not because you earned it, not because you're worthy of it, but because he chose it, he wants it, he delights in it. The only question left is, will you believe it?